Ethical sexual pleasure is holy. If you hear me say nothing else this morning, hear that. Ethical sexual pleasure is holy. I grew up with two wildly different versions of sex education. In school, there was a lot of technical information about the physiology of sex and pleasure, and there was a lot of talk about what horrible things could happen. I grew up in New York City in the 1980s and the 1990s, and truly, without fail, the message was, if you have sex, you will either get pregnant or you will get AIDS and die. The sexual education at school put the fear of God into me and many in my generation. It wasn't quite a matter of shame, but one of medical and physical health and safety. Simultaneously, I had the precursor to the Our Whole Lives curriculum that Jeannie mentioned. That precursor to OWL was called AYS, About Your Sexuality. That class also carried no shame, and it wasn't fear-based in the same way. That class is the one where I learned about condoms and dental dams and the idea that human sexuality, as expressed on one's own or with others, should not be feared, but treated as the hugely important interpersonal and ethical issue that it is. I managed to escape my sexual education without growing a sense of shame about sex. As we talked about last week, I didn't escape shame altogether, but in this I did. But for so many others, and as a result of religious teachings all too often, so many others are raised on the notion that sex is dirty, that masturbation is a sin, that pleasure should play no role because we're designed only to procreate. The big three monotheistic religions have a core story about creation that has lent itself to interpretations that reinforce shame. And of course, I'm talking about the Adam and Eve story. This Christmas, I gave my children The Brick Bible by Brendan Powell Smith. Basically, Smith spent what I can only imagine was an unreal amount of time creating Lego-style brick tableau for every story in the Bible. And this has been my children's first real introduction to these stories. They came in basically cold, and they were astonished by the creation story. The idea of a God who creates man out of clay to resemble God's self, then casts about for a companion and creates woman from that man's rib. They get to live in this beautiful place, and then along comes this snake that suggests they eat the fruit from this tree and gain knowledge, and they do it. But God's told them not to eat from this tree, and when they do, God knows because suddenly they feel shame about their nakedness, and God is enraged. And their punishment is that they're going to toil on earth, struggling to bring forth nourishment from the land, and childbirth will be agonizing, and that shame will be their companion. My Unitarian Universalist children were pretty horrified that God, who they have only ever heard me speak of as love, would do such a thing to God's beloved children. Horrified that knowledge would be considered a bad thing. And I'll admit that rereading the story with them, I was horrified anew at the implied belief that knowledge created shame about our bodies, and that the needs of our bodies to work and move, to eat, have sex, procreate were viewed as punishments. This story has resulted in millennia of pain and repression and, of course, patriarchy. From it and the various interpretations folks have made over time stem ideas about how to control women and their bodies so they don't make further mistakes. Ideas about the purpose of sex being purely for procreation and a result for being only within the confines of marriage. Ideas about masturbation as being a waste of opportunity for procreation. For millennia, too many religions and too many cultures have denied the wholeness of our bodies, ostensibly made in the image of God with all of God's capacity for pleasure, and denied what these bodies are capable of. And of course, the messages we receive about bodies and sex and pleasure don't just come from religion and this foundational story. They come from the media, from our families, potentially from painful, traumatic, or abusive experiences. These messages come from friends and from teachers. This long history of denying wholeness is also a history of increasing shame, embarrassment, enforcing self-doubting, and even self-hatred. I'm guessing that many of you have firsthand experience with the kind of terrible feeling that can come along with all that inherited shame. It isn't easy to talk about this stuff exactly because we have consciously and conscientiously made it uncomfortable over the course of human history. We have offered narrow definitions for acceptable sexual expression, and we have literally killed people to defend those notions. Honestly, many of us find it hard to talk about sex among friends, let alone on Sunday mornings amidst our spiritual community. But we are a community that rejects the dualism of mind and body. And so we have to start talking more about life in these bodies of ours and all the amazing things these bodies can feel. So I'll say it again, ethical sexual pleasure, and we're going to define what ethical is. Ethical sexual pleasure isn't just fun and doesn't just feel good. It is downright holy. That's what I contend this morning. And if it is holy, then we can drop the shame. We can drop the self-loathing, and instead we can embrace the joy. Ethical sexual pleasure is holy. So let's start with this question of ethics. My colleague, the Reverend Jen Grayson, shared with me a sermon that she preached on sex, in which she delves into the guidelines that Dr. Marie Fortune's book, Love Does No Harm, offers for healthy sexual relationships. Rev Grayson outlines these guidelines for a healthy sexual relationship that apply to all of us, regardless of our sexuality. And so although Dr. Fortune writes of these guidelines as for healthy relationships, we might also take them as our guidelines for ethical sexual relationships. An ethical sexual relationship, one, happens between peers. And not everyone is a peer, of course. Children, folks who work with us or for us, patients or clients or congregants we serve, all of those folks are off limits because the power imbalance renders consent impossible. When power differences are present, whether that power is over a job or a grade or money, there can be no assurance of real consent. And so number two, consent, that's the next guideline. And that means full, authentic, real consent, not coerced, physically or otherwise, not feigned consent. Honest to goodness, I, of my own free will, want to do this thing, consent. So real consent requires a balance of power, but it also requires full and shared information and an awareness of what will happen and what it may mean. Third, an ethical sexual relationship requires responsibility on the part of each person. Responsibility for consent, but also for protection and comfort and literal health in the form of protection against sexually transmitted diseases or unwanted pregnancies. So responsibility is one of those guidelines. And then another is faithfulness. And this doesn't necessarily mean monogamy, but faithfulness to the people with whom we are engaging in relationships, and faithfulness to ourselves and to the promises we make. It doesn't mean staying through thick and thin no matter what. Faithfulness means being open and honest and communicative about things, even things like changed feelings, even when it's hard. So we can say that an ethical sexual relationship happens with full and real consent between peers who take responsibility for each other and for themselves, and who remain honest and true to themselves and to their promises. Dr. Fortune in the book actually offers one final guideline for healthy sexual interaction, that it should be pleasurable. I'm not including it in my list for ethical sexual interaction. Here's why. Sometimes consenting peers who are responsible and faithful try a thing and it isn't pleasurable. Pleasure's the goal, of course, but it doesn't always happen. And I would argue that even beyond some sort of surface definition of pleasure, sexual interaction can create joy. And joy is the thing that moves sexual interaction from something our bodies are capable of doing to something that is holy and draws on our entire beings. And this is where we shift from our question of what is ethical to what I mean by holy. Last week, we talked about bodies, how we exist in different shapes, configurations, colors, and sizes. And we affirmed together that our bodies are ours, perfect in their differences, and that the work of loving our bodies, rejecting shaming and degradation because of our physicality, we agreed that that work is important spiritual work, because if we fail to do that work, then we acquiesce to the separation of our spirit, minds, and souls from our bodies. When we view ourselves as whole and complete beings, we understand the depth of our own holiness. When we deny the coherence and integrity of all the different parts of ourselves, we disconnect and we tear apart. Holiness is that wholeness. Holiness is that interconnection of all things, our ancestral commonality with each other and with the beginning of all things. Holiness is creation and being and joy and love and that overwhelming feeling of rightness that we glimpse once in a while when we're lucky and we've been paying attention. Holiness is the divine spark of being and life inside each of us. And that spark and being comes into its fullness in relationship. We believe here that our spiritual journey is best made in community. Our wholeness is best found in community, and so too our holiness. So when I say that ethical sexual pleasure is holy, I say it because the potential for sexual interaction to be profoundly connecting is real. The co-creation not of children, but of energy, release, joy, pleasure, love. These are elements of connection that are created through sexual interaction. Connection to each other is a way of affirming those filaments of being that hold us all together on that interconnected web. And ethical sexual pleasure is one means of connection. I hear that call for connection, that need to affirm those links. I hear that when I hear those Pablo Neruda poems read. He phrases so beautifully in ways that we can all relate to that desire to connect that drives us. We reach out for each other longingly with all of our beings. Connection is such a fundamental human need, articulated through poetry and art and music and religious ritual. It's fundamental because it's a reaching back and deep into the truth of our interconnections. And every moment and way that we connect together as human beings is an expression of that truth. It's an affirmation of that deep belief. Our connections are real, and our living out of those connections is holy. And it must be said that connecting to others is not the only kind of holy connection. So too is connecting to ourselves. We said that last week about loving our bodies. When we love our bodies, we live into our wholeness and holiness as human beings. So today we take it one step further, and I can hear your minds going, is our minister about to tell us to masturbate? You bet I am. Bringing sexual pleasure to ourselves, our whole embodied selves, safely, sanely, is an act of creation, joy, energy, self-love, and connection. All that nonsense about it being shameful, you can forget it. Connecting to yourself, knowing yourself as a whole being with body, heart, mind, and soul, all of which can know pain, but can also know pleasure. Knowing yourself intimately matters. And it matters all the more as we move through a time of enforced isolation and disconnection from each other. The pandemic has meant for some increased intimacy with loved ones, romantic or otherwise. But for many, it has meant a drop off in intimacy with others, as folks have been alone more than ever before. But we can claim that intimacy for ourselves, with ourselves, if we can let go of whatever negative messaging we have received. We can love our bodies and love on our bodies because ethical sexual interaction happens also with ourselves, and it too is holy. I realize that each of us arrives to this topic with so much. And perhaps you aren't there yet at that place where you can nod your head vigorously and agree with me that sexual pleasure that is ethical is holy. That's okay. But today, on this day when we celebrate love in all its varied forms, it's important to remember that we don't love only with our hearts and minds and souls. We also love with our bodies. We are never without these bodies of ours. Sexual joy through interaction with others or with ourselves, when it is with full consent among responsible and faithful peers, is a natural, healthy, fun, and wonderful way to affirm our whole beings and our holy living. It is ultimately an expression of love, the love that brings us closer together, the love that changes the world, the love that builds the future. May you experience joy and pleasure, wonder and love, not just on this Valentine's Day, but all the days of your life. So may it be.